This presentation is called the Asian American Population and Mental Illness. The goal of this is to identify barriers to diagnosis and treatment of mental illness in Asian culture and how to overcome them. My name is Allison Tsai. I am a third-year biochemistry major and I am from Tampa, Florida. We will begin today talking about mental illness in America. Mental illness is a growing problem. 20% of adults in the U.S. are diagnosed with a mental illness each year. 60% of adults did not use mental health services in the last year, and 90% of people who pass away due to suicide had an underlying mental illness. Mental illness is something that surrounds us. It is critical that we acknowledge how important mental illness needs to be addressed in the healthcare profession. This is very important because half of chronic mental illnesses start by the age of 14, and over 75% of them start by the age of 24. Like any other illness, the earlier the mental illness is discovered and treated, then the more successful the treatment is and the better the patient can manage their illness on their own. The Asian American population. Asian Americans is one of the fastest growing populations in the United States. Since the year 2000, the Asian American population has grown 72%. Asian Americans is a very broad term for the amount of diversity that this population contains. Asian Americans cover the entire continent of Asia, which can include Indians, Southeast Asians such as Vietnamese, Thailand, and Eastern Asians such as Chinese, Koreans, and Japanese people. What makes treating this population very difficult is the fact that this population is made up of both immigrants and people who were born here. These two groups of people present very different obstacles while pursuing treatment. For example, the mastery of language is a very, very important condition for healthcare professionals to pay attention to. If the individual or the patient cannot understand what the doctor is trying to say or answer the questions in a relatively accurate manner, then the diagnosis or the treatment may not be as effective, as efficient. In fact, they may overall fail to give the diagnosis. This is the population of which we are going to study through this research. Asian American population has always had a rough relationship with mental illness. According to the National Alliance of Mental Illness, Asian Americans' use of mental health services were 1/3 the use of the white American population. It should be noted that the suicide rates by population, Asian Americans are not one of the top. However, if we look at it among students, Asian American students have the highest suicide rate. So what's the problem? As you've noted, Asian Americans suffer tremendously from mental illness, just as any other population. However, they are one of the lowest to seek help for mental illness. It should be noted that Asian Americans who do end up being diagnosed with mental illness, typically their symptoms are much, much more severe than the average individual from another population, such as the white American. So that leads us to ask this research question. What role does Asian culture play in the diagnosis of mental illness, and how do healthcare providers address these cultural differences while treating mental health? So here's what we did. We did a literary review on research that has to do with Asian American mental illness diagnosis and healthcare professionals. We used the UF Library catalog and chose research that came from respected scientific journals. We used 4 keywords to identify the research that we would be using in our review. The keywords are Asian American, mental illness diagnosis, culture, and healthcare professionals. It should be noted that there is limited research on mental illness diagnosis. Most research is on treatment because it is much easier to identify the pool of participants for this. Furthermore, we expanded our research to include research that occurred in different countries. We hope by including research from other countries that we can see if their practices were successful in implementing the cultural sensitive approaches and hopefully we can see if it can be applied into the US. There are many findings, so here's a quick overview of what we found. We identified a couple barriers. One is collectivist culture, but more importantly, horizontal and vertical views within this collectivist culture. Language, immigrants versus American-born, acculturation, and mental illness stigma. For healthcare practices, we found that cultural sensitive approaches worked best. This includes the initial recognition of symptoms, as well as a screening test and seeking treatment. We also found that increasing training for healthcare professionals will overall lead to a great positive impact for treating these minority populations. Collectivism is often taught with individualism, and these both describe a foundational basis of which individuals think about their goals or their actions or their identity. Collectivism is a group-centric focus. Individuals' identity is built around the group's identity. This is common, so the group's goal becomes the individual's goal and vice versa. This is commonly found in Asian cultures as well as other more conservative cultures where family is a very core value. Studies have found there's a such thing as horizontal and vertical collectivism. This is focusing on how the individual views themselves as part of the group. Horizontal collectivism views the individual as equal with all the other members in their so-called group, whereas vertical collectivism has a more of a hierarchy view where they see each other as part of a system or a rank. The studies have found that vertical collectivism, the one that focuses on social status and hierarchy, tends to have a more stigmatized attitude towards mental illness. Studies have shown that collectivist culture itself is not a very good predictor on whether or not mental illness will be harder to diagnose or they will have a stigmatizing attitude. Instead, this horizontal vertical approach is much more accurate, and it is in fact built onto their own personal ideas about mental health, which can be influenced by what they perceive the group to be thinking. Another barrier against mental illness is mentality of seeking help. One of the biggest barriers to that is the stigma against mental illness. This is found in all populations, but it's interesting to note that there are some cultural differences that influence this stigma. For example, the origin of illness. According to studies, if Westerners tend to find it more shameful if the doctor attributes the mental illness to a character deficit, and they may find it more shameful to seek help. Whereas in the Eastern cultures, they tend to find it more shameful for it to be of biological origin. The reason behind it is if it was a biological origin, then perhaps the family did not raise the individual right, or the problem is much more linked to a group instead of just the individual. Another difference is perceived family support. But since collectivist cultures tend to have a very strong family influence, if the individual perceives that the family would not be as supportive, then they might find it more shameful. Of course, now that we've done some research, it's important when addressing the stigma to word it and speaks to the culture of the person you are approaching. Let's move on to healthcare practices. The current situation is that Asian Americans are escaping under the radar and are not getting diagnosed as high as other populations. What we found is that Asian Americans see a primary care physician typically, but do not use mental health care services as often as the other populations. So changes that should be implemented is that since Asian Americans see their primary care physicians and their nurses should be trained in order to be able to detect the way these specific symptoms of mental illness appear in the Asian American population. So this includes cultural sensitive screenings and more training. Training leads to confidence, and confidence means that the nurses will practice it more actively. So what's next? Future research should focus on diving into the diversity of the Asian population. It should not generalize an Asian American population and then have most of the participants be of Chinese or Korean descent. It should acknowledge that the Asian population is so diverse that there are many, many different economic and social backgrounds, and the research needs to focus on addressing the needs of each individual different population. There should also be more research on efficient application of these culturally sensitive screenings and trainings that have been found to be effective. The studies themselves, most of them note that a limitation is that it is very hard and very time consuming and very costly to implement these, which is why sample sizes are small. The following are the works cited for the research used and the images used in this presentation. Thank you for listening.